The ocean is calm tonight. Not the loud kind of calm, not the kind that demands attention, but a soft calm, the kind you almost don't notice unless you stop and listen. The waves move slowly like they have nowhere to be. They rise, they fall, and then they disappear into the shore as if they were never there at all. The sky above is fading. Blue is turning into orange. Orange into something softer, something quieter. And somewhere in that quiet there is a small island. Not famous, not crowded, not even important, at least not to the world. It's just there, surrounded by water on all sides, sitting still while everything else moves. If you were to stand on that island at this very moment, you wouldn't hear traffic. No phones. No voices, just the wind brushing gently through the trees, and the sea breathing in and out. It's the kind of place most people would visit, and then leave. But this story isn't about most people. This is about a man who came to a place like this, and decided not to leave. Not for a week, not for a month, but for 30 years. Now that might sound a little strange, because when we hear stories about people on islands, we usually think of survival. We imagine shipwrecks, storms, people stranded with no way out. We think of fear, of escape, of counting the days until rescue. But this story is different, because this man was not trapped. He was not lost. No one left him there. He chose it. He looked at the world with all its noise, its rush, its endless movement, and quietly decided it wasn't for him. And instead of trying to change the world, he walked away from it. Not in anger, not in sadness, just quietly, like someone stepping out of a crowded room because it got a little too loud. Now, if you think about it, that's not something people usually do. Most of us are taught to stay connected, to keep moving, to keep building, to keep chasing something. Bigger houses, better jobs, more things. There's always something next. And if you stop even for a moment, it can feel like you're falling behind. But this man did the opposite. He stopped. Not for a break, not for a vacation. He stopped for good, and instead of falling behind, he found something else entirely, something slower, something quieter, something most people don't even realize they're missing. Now, before we get into who he was, and how he ended up here, it's worth just sitting with this idea for a moment. A man alone on an island. No crowds, no deadlines, no constant noise in the background, just days that begin with the sun and end when the sky fades like it is now. First, that might sound peaceful, maybe even perfect, but if you let the thought stay a little longer, it also starts to feel a bit uncomfortable, because silence, real silence, is not something we're used to. When things get too quiet, we reach for something. Music, a screen, a voice, anything to fill the space. But on that island, there was nothing to fill it. Just the sound of the sea, and his own thoughts. And that's where this story really begins. Not with action, not with danger, but with a question. What happens when a person is left alone with time? Not just a few hours, not just a weekend, but years, decades. What happens to the mind? What happens to the way you see the world? Do you become lonely? Do you become lost? Or do you become something else entirely? Because here's the strange part. The man we're talking about did not just survive those years. He didn't count them like a prisoner marking lines on a wall. He lived them, fully, slowly, almost like the world had finally started moving at the right speed. And maybe, just maybe, that's the part that makes this story different. It's not about escaping danger. It's about escaping noise. It's not about being cut off. It's about choosing distance. And that choice changes everything. Because when you choose something, even something difficult, feels different. A storm you walk into is not the same as a storm you're trapped in. And this man walked into his own kind of storm, except it wasn't made of wind or rain. It was made of silence, of time, of space that stretched out in every direction. Now you might be wondering, why would anyone do this? Why leave everything behind? Why trade a busy life for one that most people would find unbearably quiet? That answer doesn't come all at once. It unfolds slowly, just like the waves, just like the days on that island. And that's what we're going to explore step by step. Not in a rush, because this isn't the kind of story you rush through. It's the kind you settle into, like sitting by the ocean at dusk, watching the light fade without needing it to hurry. So for now, just picture that island again. The trees standing still, the sky growing darker, the waves continuing their slow, endless rhythm. And somewhere on that island, a man beginning a life that almost no one else would choose. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to. And that simple choice is where everything begins. Before the island, before the silence, before the slow rhythm of waves and wind, there was a very different life. Busy, structured, full of movement. The man at the center of this story was named Brendan Grimshaw, and at first there was nothing unusual about him. He wasn't born on an island. He wasn't raised in isolation. He didn't grow up dreaming of coconuts and quiet beaches. In fact, he lived a life that many people would recognize. He worked as a journalist, which, if you think about it, is almost the opposite of silence. Journalists live in noise, deadlines, headlines, breaking stories, constant updates. There's always something happening. And if there isn't, you go find it. It's a life that moves fast. Too fast sometimes. And for a while, Brendan was part of that world. He worked in Africa during a time when things were changing quickly. Countries were shifting. Politics was intense. History was being written in real time. It was the kind of environment that keeps your mind busy and your body tired. And at first, that kind of life can feel exciting, important even. You wake up thinking today matters. You go to sleep thinking I was part of something. But over time, that feeling can change. The noise that once felt exciting starts to feel heavy. The urgency starts to feel endless. Because here's the thing about fast lives. They don't really slow down. There's always another story, another deadline, another reason to keep going. And if you're not careful, you stop noticing yourself in the middle of it. Now, we don't have a single moment where Brendan suddenly said, "That's it. I'm done." Life doesn't usually work like that. It's not one big decision. It's a series of small thoughts, small pauses, little moments where you look around and quietly think, is this really it? Maybe it happened late at night, after finishing a long day of work. Maybe it happened during a quiet moment when everything else finally stopped. Or maybe it wasn't one moment at all, just a slow realization, like a feeling that grows so gradually, you don't notice it until it's already there. A kind of restlessness, not loud, not dramatic, just present. And that restlessness didn't mean his life was bad. That's important, because walking away from something doesn't always mean it was broken. Sometimes it just means it wasn't right for you anymore. And that's a much quieter reason, a much harder one to explain to other people. Imagine telling someone, I'm leaving my career, not because I failed, but because I don't want it anymore. That's not the kind of decision people easily understand. There are no clear reasons, no obvious problems to point at, just a feeling. And feelings are difficult to justify. So for a long time nothing changed on the outside. He kept working, kept writing, kept living the life he was supposed to live. But inside, something was shifting, slowly, like the tide pulling away from the shore. And here's where it gets interesting. Most people feel this at some point. That quiet thought, what if I did something completely different? But then life steps in. Responsibilities, comfort, fear. And that thought gets pushed aside. Not because it wasn't real, but because it wasn't practical. Because let's be honest, walking away from everything you know is not exactly a safe plan. There's no guarantee, no roadmap, no step-by-step guide to disappearing onto an island and living peacefully. If there were, it would probably be a very short book. Step 1, find island. Step 2, good luck. So most people don't do it. They adjust instead. They take breaks. They change jobs. They find ways to make things more manageable. And there's nothing wrong with that. But Brendan did something else. He didn't just adjust his life. He questioned it. And once you start doing that, it's hard to stop. Because every answer leads to another question. Why am I here? What do I actually want? What would happen if I chose differently? And eventually, those questions become too loud to ignore. Now, at this point in the story, nothing dramatic has happened yet. No island, no big decision, just a man, living a normal life, and slowly realizing that normal might not be what he wants. It's a quiet stage of the story, but it's also one of the most important, because every big change starts here, not with action, but with thought, with that small, almost invisible shift in perspective. And once that shift happens, even the most ordinary things start to feel different. The busy streets feel louder. The days feel faster. The routines feel heavier. And somewhere in all of that, a new idea begins to form. Not fully shaped, not fully understood, but there, waiting. The idea that maybe, just maybe, there's another way to live. Something simpler, something slower, something quieter. At this point, Brendan didn't have the answer yet. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew one thing. He couldn't stay where he was forever. And sometimes, that's all it takes. Not a full plan, not a perfect vision, just the quiet certainty that something needs to change. And so, without any grand announcement, without any dramatic moment, the path toward that small forgotten island had already begun. He just didn't know it yet. Far away from busy cities, far from roads, offices, and crowded places, there is a group of islands scattered across the ocean, a place known as the Seychelles. From above, it looks almost unreal. Small patches of green, floating in endless blue water, like someone dropped pieces of land into the sea and forgot about them. Some of these islands are lively, full of resorts, visitors, boats coming and going, but not all of them. Some islands are quiet, too quiet, and among those quiet places, there was one island in particular, Moyen Island. If you had seen it back then, you probably wouldn't have been impressed. It wasn't neat. It wasn't developed. There were no buildings waiting to welcome you, no clear paths, no signs, no easy way to explore, just thick vegetation, wild, tangled, and completely in charge. Trees growing wherever they wanted, bushes spreading without permission, roots twisting into the ground like they were holding on to something. It didn't feel like a place meant for people. It felt like a place that had been left alone for a very long time, and in many ways it had. No one was taking care of it. No one was shaping it. No one was planning anything for it. Simply existed. And because of that, most people ignored it. Now that might sound strange. An island, in the middle of the ocean being ignored. But it happens more than you think. 'Cause value is a funny thing. People don't just look at what something is. They look at what it can be used for. Can you build on it? Can you profit from it? Can you turn it into something bigger, something better? If the answer is unclear, interest disappears quickly, and Moyan Island didn't offer clear answers. It wasn't large enough to become something grand. It wasn't easy to develop. It didn't come with ready-made comfort. It was inconvenient. And in a fast-moving world, inconvenience is often mistaken for uselessness. So the island stayed the way it was. Untouched, unwanted, left alone long enough that nature started to take over completely. Birds moved freely. Insects made their homes without interruption. Plants spread without limits. No one was there to stop anything. No one was there to control it. And over time, the island stopped feeling like a place for people at all. It became something else. Something wilder. Something quieter. Something that didn't need anyone. Now, if you were standing on the shore of that island back then, you might feel a little unsure. Not scared exactly, but aware. Aware that you are not in charge here. That you are stepping into a space that doesn't belong to you. And most people don't like that feeling. We prefer places that feel organized, predictable, designed, places where paths are already made, where directions are clear, where someone has already figured everything out. But Moyan Island had none of that. It offered no instructions, no guidance, just space and silence, and the quiet understanding that if you wanted to be there, you would have to adapt, not the other way around. That's the part most people avoid, because adapting takes effort, takes patience, takes time, and time is something people are always trying to save. So instead of seeing the island as an opportunity, they saw it as a problem. Too much work, too little reward, and so it remained untouched, year after year, waiting, not for attention, not for development, just waiting. Now here's the interesting part. Sometimes, the things that nobody wants are exactly the things that someone else is looking for. Not because they are easy, but because they are different. Because they offer something the rest of the world no longer does. And for a man who was slowly growing tired of noise, of speed, of constant movement, an island like this might not look like a problem at all. It might look like an answer. Not a perfect one, not an obvious one, but an answer nonetheless. A place where nothing is already decided, where nothing is already built, where life doesn't come with instructions, just possibilities, quiet ones, slow ones, the kind that don't rush you. Now at this point, Moyan Island was still just a place, just land surrounded by water. No story yet, no meaning, no reason for anyone to remember it. But that was about to change, because somewhere out there, there was a man, already beginning to question the life he was living. A man who wasn't looking for something bigger, but something quieter. And very soon, his path, and this forgotten island, were going to cross. And when they did, this place that no one wanted, would become everything. Some point, a thought becomes a decision, not suddenly, not loudly, but quietly like a door closing in another room. And for Brendan Grimshaw, that moment finally arrived. He had spent years in motion, years working, years surrounded by noise, urgency, and expectation. And somewhere along the way, he stopped wanting more. He started wanting less. Less noise, less pressure, less of everything that felt unnecessary. Now, most people feel this at some point, but they don't act on it. They simplify a little, take a break, maybe go on a quiet holiday and promise themselves they'll slow down, and then they go right back. Because real change is uncomfortable. It asks you to let go of things that feel safe. And safety is hard to walk away from. But Brendan did something unusual. He didn't just think about change. He moved toward it. And that's how he found the island. Not through a grand plan. Not through years of searching. But almost by chance. A conversation. An opportunity. A small, almost forgettable moment that most people would ignore. But he didn't, because when you're already looking for something different, you notice things others don't. And there it was, Moyen Island, small, unmanaged, unwanted, available. Now imagine being in his position. You have a stable life, career, a path that makes sense to everyone around you. And then someone says, "There's an island for sale." Not a house, not land in a city, an island. No roads, no buildings, no comfort waiting for you, just trees and silence. Most people would laugh, or at least pause long enough to say, "That sounds interesting, but not for me." Because buying an island like that isn't practical. It doesn't solve problems, creates them. Where will you live? What will you eat? What happens if something goes wrong? There are no easy answers. And that's exactly why most people walk away. But Brendan didn't. He saw something else. Not the problems, not the inconvenience, but the possibility. A place with no expectations, no deadlines, no noise waiting for him. Just space and time. Now here's where the decision becomes real. Because thinking about a different life is one thing. Actually choosing it, that's something else entirely. It means stepping out of everything familiar. It means saying no to the path you were already on, without knowing exactly what comes next. And that's not a comfortable feeling. There's no guarantee you're making the right choice. No one can tell you, "Yes, this will work out perfectly," because it might not. In fact, it probably won't be easy at all. But sometimes, easy is not the goal. Sometimes the goal is simply different. So he made the decision. Calmly, quietly, he bought the island. Not for millions. Not as some grand investment, but for a small amount, an amount that at the time didn't seem like much, which makes the whole thing even stranger, because this wasn't about wealth. It wasn't about status. He didn't buy the island to show it off. There was no audience, no one to impress, just him, and a piece of land in the middle of the ocean. Now imagine that moment. The papers are signed. The decision is made. There's no going back to just thinking about it. This is real. You now own a place that has no structure, no system, no plan. And whatever happens next is entirely up to you. That kind of freedom sounds exciting, but it also comes with weight, because when there are no rules, there's also no guidance. No one telling you what to do next. No instructions waiting for you. Just open space. And silence. A lot of silence. And that silence is about to become his new life. Now you might expect a dramatic reaction here. Some big moment. Excitement. Fear. Doubt. But this story doesn't move like that. It moves slowly, just like everything else that follows. So instead of a dramatic shift, there's something quieter. A calm acceptance. A sense that this is the direction things were always going. No rush. No panic. Just a step forward. And with that step, everything begins to change. Because buying the island wasn't the end of his old life. It was the beginning of something entirely new. A life with no clear structure. No familiar rhythm. No guarantees. Just a man. And an island that no one else wanted. Now, up until this point, everything has been a decision. A thought turned into action. But what comes next is different, because it's one thing to choose a new life. It's another thing entirely to step into it. So, he would arrive on that island for the first time, not as a visitor, not as someone passing through, but as someone who had chosen to stay. And that's when the real story begins, slowly revealing itself. Not all at once, never all at once, just enough for him to stay. And come morning, when the light returns and the shadows pull back, the island looks calm again, almost welcoming, as if the night never happened. But it did. And with each night that passes, he moves one step further away from the world he left behind, and one step closer to becoming part of this one. Morning on the island feels forgiving. After a night filled with unfamiliar sounds and restless thoughts, the return of sunlight feels almost like a quiet reassurance. Everything becomes visible again. The trees don't look as mysterious. The shadows don't stretch as far. Even the sounds feel softer, easier to understand. For Brendan Grimshaw, these early mornings were important, because this is when the real work began. Not dramatic work. Not heroic survival scenes like in movies. No running through jungles or building giant shelters in one day. Just small, practical steps. The kind that don't look impressive, but slowly make life possible. Now, surviving on an island sounds simple in theory. You just need a few basic things, right? Food, water, shelter. Easy. At least, that's how it sounds when you say it quickly. But on an island like Moyan Island, none of those things are handed to you. You have to find them, understand them, and sometimes fail a few times before getting them right. Let's start with water, because water isn't optional. You can go without many things. Water is not one of them. On a small island, fresh water isn't always easy to access. There are no taps, no bottles waiting in a store. So the first challenge becomes simple but serious. Where do you get it? This means exploring, walking through dense vegetation, looking for signs of moisture, understanding the land slowly. And it's not always successful. Sometimes you search and find nothing. Sometimes you think you've found a source, and it's not reliable. And that's where patience comes in, because there's no shortcut. You don't figure it out in one afternoon. You learn it piece by piece. Now food. Again, simple in theory, but in reality, not so simple. You don't just walk into a forest and find a perfect meal waiting for you. You have to know what's safe, what's edible, what's worth the effort. And in the beginning, You don't know much at all. So everything becomes an experiment. Trying different fruits, observing what grows naturally, paying attention to what animals eat. And yes, sometimes that means mistakes. Nothing dangerous enough to end the story, but enough to remind you that this isn't a supermarket. There are no labels here. No best before dates. Just trial and learning. Then comes shelter, which again sounds easy when you say it, but building something that protects you from weather, from wind, from rain, that takes time. First it's basic, very basic, something that works, not something that looks good. No design plans, no perfect structure, just enough to rest, enough to feel slightly separated from the outside. And slowly over days and weeks, it improves. Not because he suddenly becomes an expert, but because repetition teaches you. You try something, it doesn't work well, so you adjust. And that's how everything on the island develops. Not through big breakthroughs, but through small corrections. Now here's something important. At no point does this turn into chaos. There's no moment where everything falls apart and he's desperately trying to survive. Because the approach is different. It's calm, measured. Instead of rushing to solve everything at once, he focuses on one thing at a time. Water, food, shelter, each one improving slowly. And that pace makes all the difference. Because rushing leads to mistakes. And mistakes here can cost energy. And energy is something you don't waste. So instead of pushing too hard, he adapts to the island's rhythm, not forcing things to happen faster, just allowing them to happen steadily. And over time, that steady approach begins to show results. Water becomes easier to find, food becomes more predictable, shelter becomes more reliable. Nothing is perfect, but it doesn't need to be. Just needs to work. Now there's another shift happening here. A quiet one. In the outside world, most problems are solved quickly. You need something, you get it. You want something, you buy it. Time is saved whenever possible. But here, time is part of the process. You don't save it. You spend it. You invest it. And that changes how you think. Because when everything takes longer, you stop expecting instant results. You become more patient, more observant, more aware of small details, like how the sun moves across the sky, how the ground feels in different areas, how certain plants grow, and others don't. Things that most people never notice become important, and that awareness becomes one of the most valuable skills. Not strength, not speed, but attention. Because the island doesn't tell you what to do. It shows you, quietly, if you're willing to notice. Now by this point, he's not just surviving anymore. He's learning. Learning how the island works. Learning how to exist within it. And that's a big difference. Because survival feels temporary. Like something you're trying to get through. But this is something else. Something more stable. More long-term. He's not waiting to leave. He's building a way to stay. And that changes everything. Because when you know you're not going anywhere, you start thinking differently. You stop asking, how do I get through this? And start asking, how do I live here? And that question takes time to answer. But slowly, day by day, it begins to take shape. Not all at once. Never all at once. Just like everything else on the island, step by step, quietly, until one day, you realize something has changed. Not the island, but you. And without noticing exactly when it happened, you're no longer a visitor here. You're part of it. And this place, that once felt unfamiliar, starts to feel like home. For a while, it was just him, just Brendan Grimshaw, and the quiet, steady presence of Moyen Island. Days passed slowly. Work filled the hours. Silence filled everything else. And at first that silence was enough. It had a kind of peace to it. No interruptions. No conversations you didn't ask for. No noise that didn't belong. Just wind, trees, and time. But even the most peaceful silence can feel a little too complete. Not empty, just missing something small, something human. Now, this doesn't mean loneliness took over. Not in a dramatic way. There were no desperate moments, no sudden need to run back to the world. But there is a difference between choosing to be alone and never hearing another voice. And somewhere in that space, a quiet change began. Not a need for crowds, not a desire to go back, just a small opening for someone else to exist within this world. And that's when he met him, a man named René Lafortune. Now, this meeting wasn't dramatic. No grand introduction. No moment where everything suddenly changed. Just a simple connection. Local. Natural. The kind of meeting that doesn't feel important at the time, but becomes important later. René was from the nearby islands. He understood the land, the climate, the small details that outsiders often miss. And more importantly, he understood how to live with the environment instead of fighting it. Now, if you imagine this situation, you might think, finally, help has arrived. But that's not quite how it worked. Because this wasn't a rescue. Brendan wasn't waiting for someone to take over. He had already begun building his life here. What René offered was something different. Not control, not direction, just support. A second pair of hands, a second set of eyes, and sometimes a second voice. And that last part mattered more than it might seem. Because when you spend long periods alone, even simple conversations start to feel meaningful. Not because of what's being said, but because of the connection itself. A shared moment, a shared observation, something as small as, that tree wasn't here before, becomes something worth noticing together. Now their relationship wasn't built on constant talking. That's important, because too much noise would have changed the entire nature of the island, and that's not what either of them wanted. Instead, there was a kind of quiet understanding. Work happened side by side. Conversations came and went naturally. No pressure to fill every silence. No need to constantly engage. And in a way, that made the companionship stronger, because it didn't interrupt the peace, fit into it. Now, practically speaking, René's presence made things easier. Tasks that took hours alone could now be done more efficiently. Clearing paths, carrying materials, understanding the land more deeply. Two people can do more than one. That's simple. But the impact wasn't just physical. It was mental. Because when you share work with someone, the weight feels lighter. Not because the work disappears, but because it's not carried alone. And that's a subtle but powerful shift. Now, here's something interesting. Even with René there, the island never stopped feeling quiet. It never became busy, never crowded, because this wasn't a place built for many people. It was still small, still simple, still defined by space and silence. And both men seemed to understand that. There was no attempt to turn this into something larger. No plan to bring in more people. No idea of expansion. Just two individuals, working within the limits of the island, respecting it, adapting to it, and in that balance, something stable began to form. Not a community, not a society, but a kind of partnership. Loose, unforced, quietly dependable. Now, over time, this partnership would become an important part of the story, because building a life on an island is not just about surviving the environment, it's about sustaining yourself within it. And sometimes, that means allowing space for others. Not many, just enough. Enough to share the journey, without changing its nature. And that's exactly what happened here. René didn't arrive to transform the island. He arrived and became part of it. just like Brendan had. And together, they continued shaping this place. Not quickly, not dramatically, but steadily, patiently, with the same rhythm the island had always followed. Now, if you step back and look at it, this is a very unusual situation. Two men, choosing to live on a small isolated island, with no rush to leave, no pressure to grow, no need to connect with the outside world more than necessary, just existing, working, living, in a way that most people would find difficult to understand. But for them, it made sense, because once you step out of the usual pace of life, the rules change. What feels necessary becomes optional. What feels optional becomes meaningful. And something as simple as shared silence becomes enough. Now the island is no longer just a place of solitude. Something else. Something slightly more human. But still quiet. Still slow. Still far removed from the noise of the world. And with this new balance in place, the next stage begins. Guys, now, it's not just about living on the island. It's about shaping it, changing it, turning it into something more than what it was. Not for the world, not for recognition, but simply because they can. And that quiet transformation is just beginning. First, the island didn't ask for permission. It didn't wait to be understood. It simply grew, wildly, freely, in every direction at once. On Moyan Island, nature had been in charge for a long time. Trees leaned wherever they wanted. Bushes spread without limits. Paths didn't exist because nothing needed them. If you wanted to move forward, you had to push through. And for Brendan Grimshaw, this presented a quiet but constant challenge. Not danger, just resistance. Every step required effort. Every movement, intention. Now, some people might look at that and think, time to clear everything. Cut it down. Flatten it. Start fresh. Make it easier. But that's not what happened here. Because this wasn't about conquering the island. It wasn't about turning it into something controlled, something perfect. It was about working with it. And that requires a very different mindset. Instead of asking, how do I change this place? The question became, how do I exist within it? Now that doesn't mean nothing changed. In fact, a lot changed. But it happened slowly, carefully, with attention. The first step was simple. Make paths, not big roads, not wide clear walkways, just narrow trails. Enough to move through the island without fighting it every single time. So day by day, step by step, they began clearing small sections, cutting back just enough, removing what blocked the way, but leaving everything else intact. And at first it doesn't look like much. A small opening in dense greenery, a thin line where you can walk without pushing branches aside. But over time, those small paths begin to connect. One leads to another, and slowly, the island becomes easier to move through. Not controlled, just understood. Now here's where things take an interesting turn, because once movement becomes easier, possibility expands. You're no longer limited to one small area. You can explore more, work in different places, see how everything connects. And that's when the next idea begins. Planting. Not for survival, not because food was missing, but because something deeper was happening. A desire to shape the island gently, to add something rather than take away. And so trees were planted. Not a few, thousands. Over time, tens of thousands. Now imagine that for a moment. Planting a tree is simple. You dig a hole, place it carefully, cover it. Done. But planting thousands? That's not a task. That's a commitment. Because trees don't grow quickly. They don't respond to effort in a day, or even a year. They take time, real time, the kind you can't speed up. So this wasn't about immediate results. It was about patience. Planting something today, knowing it might take years to fully grow. and still choosing to do it, again and again, and again. Now, from the outside, this might look like work, hard work, but from the inside, feels different, because when you're not rushing, when you're not trying to finish something quickly, work becomes something else. It becomes rhythm. Wake up, walk the paths, plant, clear, observe, repeat, not because you have to, but because that's what the day offers. And over time, that rhythm becomes natural, comfortable, almost peaceful. Now, as the trees began to grow, something subtle started to change. The island responded, not in a dramatic way, but quietly. More shade appeared. The air shifted slightly. The ground felt different underfoot. And with those changes, life began to return. Small at first, birds visiting more often, insects settling into new areas, nature adjusting, responding to the work being done. And this is where the idea of taming becomes a little misleading, because nothing here was being forced. There were no strict lines, no rigid structure. The island wasn't being turned into a garden. It was being guided, encouraged, shaped just enough. And that's an important difference, because forcing nature usually leads to resistance, but working with it, that creates balance. Now, there's also something else happening during this time, something internal, because when you spend hours doing slow, repetitive work, with no rush, no deadline, your mind changes. It quiets down. Not completely, but enough. Enough that thoughts don't feel crowded. Enough that time doesn't feel like something you're chasing. And in that quiet, simple things start to matter more. The way light moves through the trees, the sound of leaves shifting in the wind, the feeling of progress, even when it's small. Things that would go unnoticed in a fast life become part of your day, and that changes how you experience everything. Now, by this point, the island is no longer the same place it once was. It's still wild, still natural, but there's a new layer to it. A human touch. Not heavy, not overwhelming, just present. Paths where there were none. Trees planted with intention. Spaces that invite movement instead of resisting it. And all of this, built slowly, without pressure, without the need to finish quickly. Just steady effort, over time. Now, if you step back and look at it, this isn't just about changing the island. It's about building something, not a structure, not a project meant to be completed and checked off, but something ongoing, something that continues to grow, even when you're not actively working on it. And that kind of creation feels different, because it's not about control, it's about participation, being part of something that evolves slowly. Now, the island is beginning to feel less like a challenge, and more like a place that responds, place that changes, a place that, in its own quiet way, acknowledges the effort being put into it. And with that shift, another stage begins, because as the land transforms, so does the life around it. Soon, the island won't just be shaped by human hands, it will be filled with something else. Something that was always meant to be there. Life, returning step by step. By now, things are no longer new. Not in the way they were at the beginning. The sounds are familiar. The paths are known. The island feels understood. On Moyan Island, life has started to settle into something steady. Not repetitive in a boring way, but rhythmic. And for Brendan Grimshaw, that rhythm becomes everything. Because when there are no schedules, no clocks telling you where to be, the day begins differently. It doesn't start with an alarm. It starts with light. The sun rises slowly, and with it the island wakes up. Birds begin to move. The air shifts. The quiet of night gently fades into the quiet of morning. And that's when the day begins. Not because it has to, but because it feels right. Now, mornings are not rushed. There's no list waiting to be completed as quickly as possible. Instead, there's a simple awareness of what needs to be done. Walk the paths, check the trees, clear what needs clearing. Nothing urgent, nothing demanding, just steady movement. And that changes how time feels. Because in most lives, time is something you manage. You divide it, you plan it, you try to use it efficiently. But here, time is something you move with. You don't chase it. You don't try to control it. You follow it. And when you do that, something interesting happens. The day feels longer. Not in a tiring way, but in a full way. Each hour has space in it. Space to notice things. Like how the light changes as the sun moves higher. How the temperature shifts slightly between morning and midday. How the island itself seems to breathe slowly. Now as the day continues, work happens. But again, not in a rushed or pressured way. Tasks are done because they're there. Not because they need to be finished by a certain time. If something takes longer, that's fine. If something waits until tomorrow, that's fine too. And this is where the rhythm becomes clear. There's no separation between work time and free time. It's all the same, because everything you do is part of living there. Planting trees isn't a job. It's part of the day. Clearing paths isn't a task. It's just something that happens. And when you stop dividing time like that, it feels different, simpler. Now, of course, there are moments of rest. But even rest doesn't feel like a break from something. It feels natural. You sit when you're tired. You stop when the work is done. Or when you've done enough. No guilt. No pressure. Just balance. Now, one of the most noticeable changes is how the mind adjusts to this pace. In a fast life, your thoughts are always moving, jumping from one thing to another, planning ahead, looking back, trying to keep up. But here, that speed slows down. Not immediately, but gradually. First, the mind still races, still tries to fill every moment with something. But over time, it realizes something. There's nothing to chase. Nothing waiting just around the corner. No sudden demands. And so, it begins to settle. Thoughts become quieter, longer, more spaced out. And in between them, there's something else. Stillness. Not empty, just calm. Now, this doesn't mean every moment is peaceful. There are still challenges. Things that don't go as planned. Days that feel heavier than others. But even those moments are part of the rhythm. They come and they pass. Nothing stays urgent for long, because there's nothing pushing it forward. Now as days turn into weeks, and weeks into months, something even more interesting happens. You stop counting. Not completely, but the exact number of days stops feeling important. Because when every day follows a similar rhythm, time blends together. Not in a confusing way, but in a smooth way. Like waves, each one separate, but also part of a continuous flow. And in that flow, you don't feel like you're moving through time. Feels like time is moving around you. Now imagine living like that. No rush. No constant reminders of what's next. Just one day followed by another. Each one simple. Each one complete in its own way. For most people, that might sound too quiet, too slow, even boring. But here's the strange part. It's not. Because when you remove the noise, you start noticing the details. And those details fill the space. The way leaves move in the wind. The sound of footsteps on different ground. The small changes in the island from one day to the next. Things that would normally go unnoticed become part of your experience. And that makes each day feel different, even when it looks the same. Now by this point, the island is no longer something he's adjusting to. It's something he's living within. Completely. The rhythm is no longer external. It's internal. It's part of how he thinks, how he moves, how he experiences time. And that's a big shift. Because once that happens, there's no need to go back to the old pace. It doesn't feel natural anymore. It feels distant, like something that belonged to another life. Now the island continues as it always has. The sun rises. The sun sets. The waves move in their slow, steady pattern. And within that, a life unfolds. Not dramatic, not fast, but steady, quiet, and deeply consistent. And as that rhythm continues, something else begins to change. Not in the routine, but in the world around it. Because the island is not just being lived on, it's growing, responding, becoming something new. And very soon, that change will become impossible to ignore. Because life, in all its forms, is beginning to return. First, the island felt full. Not empty, not silent. Just full in a quiet, hidden way. There were insects, birds passing through, small movements in the trees, but nothing that stayed. Nothing that truly belonged there long term. On Moyan Island, life existed, but it didn't settle. And for a long time that didn't seem unusual. Because when a place has been left alone, unbalanced, takes time for things to return. Not days, not weeks, sometimes years. Now as Brendan Grimshaw continued shaping the island, planting trees, clearing paths, allowing space to grow, something subtle began to shift. Not all at once, never all at once, but slowly, the island started to feel different, more stable, more welcoming, not to people, but to something else, to life. And the first signs were easy to miss. A bird staying longer than usual, another returning the next day, small patterns forming where before there were none. Now birds are often the first to notice change. They don't need invitations. They simply arrive when a place feels right. And when they do, they bring something with them. Seeds, movement, energy. And suddenly, the island isn't just growing from what's planted. It's growing on its own. Now this is where things begin to become noticeable. Because when birds stay, other things follow. Insects multiply in new areas. Plants begin to spread naturally. The balance starts to rebuild itself. And slowly, the island becomes more alive. Not louder, just fuller. Now, one of the most remarkable changes came in the form of something much slower, much quieter, but impossible to ignore once you see it. Giant tortoises, large, ancient-looking, moving at a pace that makes everything else feel fast. These weren't creatures in a hurry. They didn't rush. They didn't react quickly. They simply existed. And when they began to appear on the island, it marked something important. Because animals like that don't settle just anywhere. They need stability. They need an environment that supports them, consistently. And that meant one thing. The island was no longer just surviving. It was sustaining life. Now imagine walking along one of the paths and seeing one of these tortoises for the first time. Not moving quickly. Not reacting to your presence. Just there. Calm. Unbothered. As if it had always belonged. And in a way, now it did. Now over time, more followed. Not in huge numbers at once, but gradually, each one becoming part of the landscape, part of the rhythm. And with them, the island changed again. Because their presence wasn't just visual. It was functional. They moved through the land slowly, affecting the ground, the plants, the balance. They became part of the system, not separate from it. And that's when it becomes clear. This is no longer a place being shaped by one person. It's a place evolving on its own, responding, adapting, growing beyond the original effort. Now there's something deeply calming about watching life return to a place. Not forced, not engineered, just happening. Because when something grows naturally, feels different, more stable, more real. Now for most people, animals are something you observe from a distance, something you visit or watch. But here, they're not separate. They're part of daily life. You walk past them, You notice their patterns. You adjust your movement around them. Not because you have to, but because it feels right. Now here's the interesting part. Even as the island becomes more alive, it doesn't become chaotic. It doesn't lose its calm, because everything that returns fits within the rhythm that already exists. Nothing rushes. Nothing overwhelms. It all moves at the same slow pace, and that keeps the balance. Now over time, the island begins to feel complete. Not perfect, but whole. Where once there was just overgrowth and silence, there is now structure and life. Paths, trees, birds, tortoises, each one playing a role, each one existing without disrupting the others. And in the middle of it all, a man who chose to be there, not controlling everything, not directing every change, just allowing it to happen and guiding it when needed. And that's an important distinction, because this isn't ownership in the usual sense. It's not about possession. It's about responsibility, care, attention. Now, if you step back and look at the island, it's no longer something forgotten, something alive, something that continues to grow, even without constant effort. And that's when you realize, this isn't just a story about isolation anymore. It's a story about creation, about what happens when time, patience, and quiet effort are allowed to work together. Now, as life continues to return, another contrast begins to form, because while this small island is growing slowly naturally, the rest of the world is moving in the opposite direction, faster, louder, more connected than ever. And somewhere between those two worlds, a distance begins to grow, not just physical, but something deeper. And that distance will soon become impossible to ignore. While life on Moyan Island moved slowly, the rest of the world did the opposite. Faster, busier, louder with every passing year. Cities grew. Technology changed how people lived. News traveled quicker than ever. Somewhere out there, people were rushing through their days, checking clocks, chasing deadlines, planning what comes next. And here, none of that existed. For Brendan Grimshaw, time didn't feel like something to keep up with. It didn't race ahead. It didn't leave him behind. It simply moved, steady, unbothered. Now, this doesn't mean he was completely cut off. The world didn't disappear. Boats still passed in the distance. Occasional visitors came and went. News existed somewhere beyond the horizon, but it all felt far away. Like hearing about a storm in another country. You know it's happening, but you don't feel the wind. And that distance changed how everything was experienced. Because when you're not constantly surrounded by updates, you stop reacting to every small thing. You stop feeling like you need to know everything right now. Instead, you focus on what's in front of you. The island, the work, the day itself. Now years begin to pass. Not in a dramatic way. No big markers. No countdown. Just one day followed by another. And slowly, decades begin to form. Think about that for a moment. Decades. In most lives, decades are filled with change. Different jobs. Different places. New people. New problems. Life moves in chapters. Clear shifts from one stage to another. But here, the changes are quieter. Less obvious. The island grows. The trees get taller. The paths become more defined. But the core of life remains the same. And that creates a strange kind of stability. The kind most people rarely experience. Because in a fast world, everything feels temporary. Always changing, always moving towards something else. But on the island, nothing is trying to become something else. Just is. Now, from the outside, this might look like being left behind, like stepping out of the flow of progress, missing out on everything happening in the world. But from the inside, doesn't feel like that at all. Feels like stepping out of noise, like choosing not to follow every change. Not because it's bad, but because it's not necessary. Now here's something subtle. When you remove yourself from constant updates, you begin to notice something. Most things aren't as urgent as they seem. News fades. Trends pass. What felt important one moment is forgotten the next. But the things on the island, they don't fade. The trees you plant stay. The paths you clear remain. The life you build continues. And that creates a different sense of importance. Not based on speed, not based on attention, but based on presence. Now over time, the gap between these two worlds grows. The fast world and the slow one. And Brendan stands quietly in between. Not completely disconnected, but no longer part of the rush. And eventually, something unusual happens. He becomes almost invisible to the world. Not in a mysterious way, just in a quiet, unnoticed way. Because when you step away from the systems people rely on, you stop appearing in them. No daily interactions, no constant communication. Just a man, living on an island, while everything else continues without him. And yet, nothing feels missing. That's the surprising part. Because the assumption is always the same. If you leave the world, you lose something. But here, doesn't feel like loss. Feels like space. Space to think. Space to live. Space to exist without constant interruption. Now this doesn't mean the world stops mattering. It's still there. Still moving. Still changing. But it's no longer the center. The island is. And within that space, a different kind of life continues. Steady. Quiet. Unbothered by the speed of everything else. And as that distance grows, another question begins to rise. Not about the world outside, but about the world within. Because when everything around you becomes quiet, there's only one place left for noise to come from. Your own mind. And that's where the next part of the story begins. Silence is an interesting thing. First, feels peaceful, calming, like a break from everything that usually fills your day. But when it stays, when it doesn't go away, it begins to change. Not suddenly, not in a way you can point to and say, this is where it happened. But gradually, quietly, on Moyen Island, silence was always present. Even with the sound of waves, even with birds and wind, there was a deeper quiet underneath it all. And for Brendan Grimshaw, that silence became part of daily life. Not something to escape, something to live with. Now let's be clear. This wasn't complete isolation. There were moments of interaction, conversations, shared work. But those moments were limited. And most of the time, it was just him and his thoughts. Now here's where things become more personal. Because being alone is not the same as feeling lonely. You can choose solitude and still feel at peace. And for a long time, that's exactly what happened. The quiet felt right. The space felt natural. There was no strong need to fill it. But that doesn't mean loneliness never appeared. It did. Just not in the way people expect. Not dramatic. Not overwhelming. More like a passing feeling. A small shift in the air. Moments where something feels slightly incomplete. Maybe during the evening, when the light fades and the day slows down. Maybe during a quiet task, when there's no one to share the moment with. Not a problem, just noticeable. And then, passes. Because on the island, there's nothing feeding that feeling. No constant reminders of what you're missing. No comparisons. No noise telling you that you should feel different. Just space. And in that space, feelings come and go. Naturally. Now there's another side to silence. One that people don't talk about as often. When the outside world becomes quiet, the inside world becomes louder. Thoughts that were once buried under noise begin to rise. Memories, old conversations, questions that were never fully answered. They don't rush in all at once. They appear slowly, like waves, one at a time, and when they do, you can't ignore them. There's nothing else to distract you, no quick escape, no easy way to push them aside. So instead, you sit with them, you think about them, you let them exist, without trying to fix everything immediately. And that process changes you, because most people don't spend that kind of time with their own thoughts. There's always something pulling attention away. But here, there's nowhere else to go. And over time, that becomes less uncomfortable, more familiar. Your thoughts stop feeling like something to avoid, and start feeling like something to understand. Now, this doesn't mean everything becomes peaceful all the time. There are still moments of restlessness, moments where the quiet feels a little too heavy. But those moments don't last, because the rhythm of the island gently pulls things back into balance. The work, the movement, the natural flow of the day. It keeps everything grounded. Now, here's something important. Silence, when accepted, stops feeling empty. It starts feeling full. Not with noise, but with awareness. You notice more. You feel more connected to what's around you. Not in a dramatic way, just steadily. And in that steady awareness, loneliness doesn't disappear, but it changes. It becomes softer, less like a problem, and more like a passing state, something that comes and goes without taking over. Now, by this point, silence is no longer something new. It's not something to adjust to. It's something that belongs, just like the trees, just like the sea. And within that silence, a life continues, not crowded, not loud, but complete in its own way. And that completeness leads to something unexpected, because when you remove most of the noise, you begin to see value differently. What matters? What doesn't? What's worth holding on to? And what isn't? And very soon, that new way of seeing things will be tested, because the outside world hasn't forgotten completely, and it's about to come knocking in a very different way. By now, life on Moyen Island had settled into something steady. The trees were growing, the paths were clear, the rhythm of each day felt natural. For Brendan Grimshaw, this was no longer an experiment. It wasn't something temporary. It was life, simple, quiet, complete in its own way. And then, the outside world began to notice. Not all at once, but slowly. Stories travel, especially unusual ones. A man living alone on an island, building something over years, without chasing attention. That kind of story doesn't stay hidden forever. First it was small. A visitor here. Conversation there. People curious but not deeply involved. But curiosity grows. And eventually, it turns into interest. Now, when interest meets something unique, it often leads to one thing: value. Not emotional value, not personal meaning, but financial value. Because from the outside, the island looked different now. Not wild and forgotten anymore, but developed in a quiet, natural way. Trees planted, life restored, a space that felt alive. And suddenly, people began to see potential. Not the quiet kind, the profitable kind. What could this become? How much is it worth now? What if we turned it into something bigger? Resorts, hotels, luxury spaces, the kind of ideas that follow any beautiful place. And eventually, the offers came. Not small ones, serious ones, large amounts of money. For a small island. Now imagine that moment. You've spent years building something. Slowly, patiently, without thinking about profit, without trying to impress anyone. And suddenly, someone offers you more money than you've ever had, in exchange for all of it. The land, the work, the life you've created. Most people would at least consider it, because money solves problems. It creates options. It makes life easier. And in many ways, It represents success. But here's where this story takes a different path. Because for Brendan, the island was never about money. It wasn't an investment. It wasn't something he built to sell later. It was something he lived in, something he became part of. And that changes everything. Because when something becomes part of your life, you don't measure it the same way. You don't ask, how much is this worth? You ask something else. What would I lose if I let this go? And the answer wasn't simple. It wasn't just land. It wasn't just trees. It was time. Years of it. Moments that couldn't be replaced. A way of living that didn't exist anywhere else. And no amount of money could recreate that. Now, from the outside, this decision might seem strange, even unreasonable, turning down large sums of money for something that could easily be sold. But that's because the outside world measures value differently. It looks at numbers, at potential profit, at what something can become in the future. But life on the island wasn't about the future in that way. It was about the present, about what already existed, about what had been built slowly. And that kind of value doesn't translate into numbers easily. So he refused. Not dramatically, not with speeches or big statements, just quietly. No. And then again, when more offers came, still no. Now here's something interesting. Saying no to money is often harder than earning it, because money gives you choices. It opens doors, and turning it down means closing those doors on purpose. But in this case, those doors didn't matter, because the life he had chosen didn't depend on them. Everything he needed was already there. The island, the rhythm, the quiet. Nothing was missing, so there was nothing to replace. Now over time, this decision became part of the story. The man who wouldn't sell, the man who chose something else over wealth. And people tried to understand it. Some admired it. Some questioned it. Some probably thought, he'll change his mind eventually. But he didn't, because this wasn't a temporary choice. It wasn't something he was testing. It was something he believed in. A different way of defining success. Not by how much you have, but by how little you need. Now that idea sounds simple, almost obvious. But living it, that's something else entirely. Because it requires letting go of everything you've been taught to chase. More money, more comfort, more recognition, and replacing it with something quieter. Enough. Just enough. Now on the island, that idea made sense. Because everything was already built around it. No excess. No constant desire for more. Just balance. And in that balance, wealth looked different. It wasn't stored in banks. It wasn't counted. It was experienced. In time. In space. In the freedom to live without pressure. And that kind of wealth is difficult to explain, but easy to feel. Now as the world continued to offer more, he continued to say no. And with each refusal, the distance between his life and the rest of the world grew a little wider. Not in conflict, not in disagreement, just in difference. Two ways of living, moving in opposite directions. And for him, there was no confusion about which one he had chosen. Because once you build a life like this, slowly, carefully, you don't walk away from it easily. Not for money, not for convenience, not for anything that doesn't match what you've already found. And what he had found was something the world couldn't offer him, no matter the price. Now with that choice made clear, the story moves forward, because the island is no longer just a place to live, something to protect, something to preserve, not just for now, but for what comes next. And that responsibility is about to grow. By now, the island was no longer just a place to live. It was something more. Something that had taken years to shape, years to understand, years to grow into what it had become. On Moyen Island, everything carried a kind of quiet history. Every path had been walked many times. Every tree had been planted with intention. Every change had happened slowly. And for Brendan Grimshaw, that created a new question. Not how to live here anymore, but how to protect it. Because once something becomes valuable to you, not in money but in meaning, you start thinking about its future. What happens to it later? What happens when you're not there every day? And that's where things shift again. Because protecting something like this is very different from building it. Building is active. You plant. You clear. You shape. Protection is quieter. It's about maintaining balance. Making sure nothing disrupts what already works. Now the biggest threat wasn't obvious. It wasn't storms. It wasn't nature turning against itself. It was people. Not in a negative way, just in a natural way. Because once a place becomes beautiful, once it becomes known, more people want to experience it. And with people comes change. Paths become crowded. Spaces become altered. Decisions are made not for balance but for convenience. And slowly, the original feeling of a place can disappear. Now that's not always a bad thing. But for Moyen Island, it would have changed everything. Because what made it special was its quiet balance. The way nature and human effort existed together, without one overpowering the other. So protecting the island meant one thing. Keeping that balance intact. Not turning it into something bigger. Not expanding it beyond what it naturally allowed. Just preserving what was already there. Now this required a different kind of thinking. Long-term thinking. Not days. Not months. Years. Decades. Because the island wasn't just about the present moment. It was something that would continue long after. And that meant making decisions that didn't just work now, but would still work later. Now, one of the most important steps in that process was ensuring the island couldn't be easily changed in the future. Because as long as it remained just private land, there was always a risk that one day, someone else might see it differently, might decide to develop it, transform it, turn it into something else entirely. And all those years of quiet effort could be undone quickly, not out of harm, just out of a different vision. So the goal became clear. The island needed protection, beyond a single person. It needed a structure, something that would outlast individual choices. Now this is where the idea of preservation takes shape. Not as control, but as commitment. A decision that says, this place should remain as it is. Not frozen, not untouched, but balanced. Now, protecting the island didn't mean shutting it off completely. It didn't become a forbidden space. People could still visit, still experience it, but with limits, with respect for what it was, not what it could be turned into. And that distinction is what kept it intact. Now, there's something quietly powerful about this stage, because it shows a different kind of care. Not just creating something beautiful, but ensuring it stays that way, even when you're no longer there to guide it. And that kind of thinking is rare, because most people build for the present, for what they can see, for what they can use. But this was about something else, about continuity, about leaving something behind that doesn't lose its meaning over time. Now, as these protections take shape, the island becomes more than just a personal space. It becomes a responsibility, not heavy, not overwhelming, but important. Because now, it's not just about one life. It's about the life of the island itself, and everything within it. The trees, the animals, the quiet balance that has been carefully built. All of it depends on maintaining what already works. Now, if you look at it from the outside, this might seem like the final stage. The island is built, protected, stable, but the story isn't finished. Because even when something is preserved, Time continues. Life continues. And eventually, change arrives in a different form. Not from the outside world. Not from sudden disruption. But from something much more natural. Time itself. And as the years continue to pass, that quiet, steady rhythm begins to shift once again. Not on the island, but in the life of the man who chose it. And that's where the story moves next. For a long time, the island remained quiet. Not hidden exactly, but not widely known either. Life on Moyan Island continued at its own pace. Steady, calm, and mostly undisturbed. But stories have a way of traveling. Slowly at first. A mention here. Passing comment there. A man living alone on an island. A place transformed over years. Simple ideas but unusual enough to stick. And eventually, people became curious. Not everyone. Just a few at first. Travelers passing nearby. Writers looking for something different. People who had heard just enough to wonder, is this real? And so, they came. Now these weren't crowds. There were no lines of boats arriving every day. No sudden rush of attention. Just occasional visitors. Arriving quietly, stepping onto the island, and looking around with a kind of careful curiosity, because the moment they arrived, they noticed something. The silence. Not empty silence, but a full one. The kind that feels intentional. The kind that makes you lower your voice, even without being asked. And then, they saw the island itself. The trees. The paths. The balance between wild and shaped. Everything felt different. Not like a place designed for tourism. Not like something built for show. But something lived in. Something that had grown naturally over time. And in the middle of it all, they met Brendan Grimshaw. Now this is where expectations usually shift. Because when people hear about someone living like this, they imagine something extreme. Someone disconnected. Someone distant. Someone who has completely stepped away from everything. But that's not what they found. What they found was someone calm, grounded, unhurried, not eager to impress, not trying to explain everything, just present. And that often surprised them, because in a world where people are used to fast conversations, quick answers, clear explanations, this felt different. There was no rush. Questions were answered slowly, sometimes simply, sometimes not at all, not out of avoidance, but because not everything needed to be explained. Now for visitors, this created an unusual experience. Because they didn't just see the island, they felt it. The pace, the stillness, the way time seemed to stretch just a little longer than usual. And even short visits left an impression. Not loud, not overwhelming, but noticeable. Like stepping into a different version of life, and then stepping back out again. Now here's something important. These visits didn't change the island. That balance remained. Because the number of visitors stayed small, controlled, enough to share the space, but not enough to transform it. And that was intentional, because too many people would have shifted everything. The quiet would fade, the rhythm would break, the space would begin to feel crowded. And that's exactly what this place was not meant to become. So instead, it stayed limited, personal. Visitors came and then they left. And once they were gone, the island returned to itself. Quiet again. Steady again. As if nothing had changed. Now over time, these visits became part of the story. Articles were written. Stories were shared. The idea of the man on the island spread further. And with that, more curiosity followed. But still, the core remained untouched. Because attention doesn't always lead to change. Not when it's handled carefully. Now, from the outside, people tried to understand this life. Some saw it as peaceful. Some saw it as unusual. Some probably thought, it's beautiful, but I couldn't do it. And that's fair. because this kind of life is not for everyone. It requires something different, a willingness to slow down, to let go of constant connection, to accept silence, not as emptiness, but as something meaningful. And not everyone wants that. Now for Brendan, these visits didn't pull him back into the outside world. They didn't change how he lived. They were just moments, brief connections, windows between two very different ways of life. And once they passed, the rhythm continued, uninterrupted. Now there's something quietly powerful about that, because it shows something important. You don't have to completely disconnect. To live differently, you can allow small connections without losing your space, without losing your balance. And that's exactly what happened here. Now, as the years continue to pass, the island remains what it has become: alive, balanced, quietly known but not changed. Visitors come and go. Stories continue to spread. But at its core, nothing essential shifts. And yet, time keeps moving. Not in a rushed way, not in a noticeable way, but steadily, always forward. And with that steady movement, another stage begins. Not on the island itself, but in the life of the man who has spent so many years within it. Because no matter how stable a place becomes, life continues to change. So, that change will become impossible to ignore. Not sudden, not dramatic, but real. And it will shape everything that comes next.